Here's another example that poses a serious problem for utilitarianism. Now, we have institutions like promises. And I say they're institutions because along with them come certain, what we think are moral obligations. That is, if we think about it in general, if you've promised somebody that you're going to do something, you've incurred an obligation. Morally, you ought to keep your promise. It doesn't matter if the person's going to be able to force you to. It doesn't even matter if the person's still going to be alive. But the point is, for example, you borrow $5 from somebody, tell them you're going to pay it back next week, and the person dies in the meantime, you still should be paying it to the person's heirs. You still owe the person the money. You haven't lost your obligation. But utilitarianism, we're going to see through this example, has a problem explaining the whole notion of promising. And we can make similar kinds of points with respect to other kinds of obligations like this. For example, truth-telling, honesty, all kinds of institutions, you might say, that we have, practices that we have that incur moral consequences or that make moral obligations. But let's think of this one example that we'd like to talk about, or I'd like to talk about. Now, there's an elderly grandfather, loves sailing. He realizes that, this could be his last hurrah, so to speak. This could be his final trip. So he decides to take his very large boat, a huge sailboat around the world, and he's going to take his grandson along with him. Now, his grandson's been kind of a spoiled guy and oftentimes doesn't do the right thing, but his grandfather makes it clear to him before they're leaving. I'm financing this trip, the grandfather says, but I want you to promise me that if I die during the course of the trip, you're going to bury my body according to certain religious rituals. It has to be buried, it can't be cremated, it can't be at sea. These are my religious principles. And the grandson agrees. And everybody in the family, they think it's a little ludicrous that the grandfather's going on this trip, but they understand what could happen. After a month at sea, while stopped near a desert island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, an uncharted island, the grandfather dies. So the first question we want to ask is, what's the right thing for the grandson to do? And I think initially, having heard the example, what do we think? We have this institution of promises. It doesn't matter if the grandfather's alive. It doesn't matter the fact that it was his grandfather. He promised to do something, and we think he has a moral obligation to do it. But let's now turn to see what utilitarianism has to say about this example.